The cool thing about diversity in the 80s is that nobody seemed to give a shit about it. On the one hand, you didn't have people complaining about it, and on the other hand, you didn't have anyone crowing about it either. It just existed in a very natural, sort of intrinsic way that we all took for granted. And as an example, I would like to show you the box office results for 1984. I would have been about 15 years old, and I saw, I think, almost every single one of these movies, and most of them were quite diverse. And at the time, I didn't think of them as diverse. I just thought of them as cool flicks, and I would like to share them with you, so you can see, you know, what we were all about in the 80s and why diversity was not invented in 2015. So here we go. Number one, we have Beverly Hills Cop. At the time, Eddie Murphy was, well, if you look at this list, the biggest movie star in the world. Everybody loved him. He came off of Saturday Night Live and made all of us want to, you know, get on Saturday Night Live and try to do what he did. But of course, nobody could do what he did. He was also a stand up comedian, and he was just so charismatic and so funny and so edgy. And when you watched an Eddie Murphy movie, you know it was just going to be a good time. Uh, he kind of lost his edge as the years went on, but then so does everybody else. So you can't really hold that against him. But I mean, that was the number one movie of 1984. At number two, we have Ghostbusters. Of the four Ghostbusters, we had one black Ghostbuster who was Ernie Hudson, who I adore. I mean, I wasn't the biggest fan of Ghostbusters, but I loved Ernie in The Crow, starring Brandon Lee, who was also of mixed race, incidentally. And I I think that if you look at his career, it would have been nice to have seen him in more things, more prominent things. But he was always a working actor, and I don't think there was anybody ever who didn't like Ernie Hudson. Number three, we have Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which I wouldn't say is a paragon of diversity, but what am I going to say about Indiana Jones? Everybody loves Harrison Ford. It's a lot of fun. At four, we have Gremlins, which is interesting in a way because the female lead of Gremlins was, of course, Phoebe Cates, who at the time I called Phoebe Katz, and you can see me struggling to pronounce her name even now. I remember talking about Phoebe Cates at the Dairy Queen where I worked with a colleague, and I called her Phoebe Katz, and she looked at me, and I could see that she was wondering how stupid could you possibly be, and the answer is, impossibly stupid, which I still am today. But the thing about Phoebe Cates is that I think a lot of people don't even realize that she was a Eurasian of mixed race. Nobody ever thought about it at the time. It was just taken for granted. She was just the most beautiful girl in film. And of course, beauty is an international language, and she spoke it fluently. At number five, we have Karate Kid. I don't know if this movie is considered a problem these days, but all I can tell you is that Pat Morita was a wonderful role model, especially for those of us from more chaotic households. He had quiet dignity and strength, and he could move you to tears. And he could also inspire you with his physicality. I mean, of course, they use stuntmen. And he could make you laugh. He was just a very talented actor, and it was really such a wonderful role. Number 6, we have Police Academy, which I didn't see because it looked impossibly stupid. But it also featured some black performers in very prominent roles. Uh, let's see who we have here. Michael Winslow. Do you remember the guy who made all the sound effects? That was Michael Winslow. Bubba Smith, who played Hightower, an enormous fellow. And then there was Marion Ramsey. I mean, out of all the police academy cadets, I think a good portion of them, a good proportion of them were black. And I don't think anybody cared or commented one way or another. It's just what it was. Now we come down to Footloose, which might be the whitest movie ever made. It's funny, I was looking at the soundtrack of Footloose thinking, well, it's kind of white, but they must have. I didn't see Footloose either. Believe it or not, I never saw the original Footloose because it just looks impossibly boring to me. I did watch the remake of Footloose because I had to watch it to write a review on it or something like that. And I remember not being crazy about that either. But I was looking at the soundtrack for the original Footloose to see if they used a lot of black artists, and they just didn't. It was like kind of Kenny Loggins and a bunch of other white dudes. But yeah, I mean, if you're a fan of Footloose, that's great. I like the message, that dancing should be allowed in our towns and cities. I think that's a good message for people. But I don't have a lot to say about Footloose. Romancing the Stone. I never saw Romancing the Stone either for the same reason, because it looked really boring. But I do remember that Romancing the Stone did have a great soundtrack and theme song. And I'm just looking up the guy who did the theme song right now, and it was Eddie Grant. And I remember loving this song. And in fact, I got so juiced by this song in my little town that I was playing around in my car, and I ended up blowing the transmission on my car, and my dad and I didn't get around to fixing it for several months. So thanks a lot, Eddie Grant, for getting a teenage me so hyped up that I wrecked my car because of your song. Now we come to number 9, Star Trek 3, A Search for Spock. And when I talk about intrinsic diversity, I think Star Trek has had it since the beginning, of course, with the wonderful Nichelle Nichols, R.I.P. Diversity was just baked into the very fabric of Star Trek in a very natural way. And Nichelle, of course, played Uhura, was, I guess you would say, my very first crush. I mean, when I was 5 or 6 years old, she was the first woman I saw who I'm like, wow, she's so beautiful. And I think to this day, I still think she's one of the most beautiful women who ever lived and a great inspiration. Number 10, Splash, with John Candy and Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah. Like Footloose, I mean, it's pretty white. I mean, but it was fun. I mean, if you look at mermaids as being diverse, then kudos to Splash. This is the movie that I wanted to talk about the most, though. At number 11 is Purple Rain. I mean, it doesn't get any better than Prince. This is my favorite movie of all time, and when people ask me why, I say it has the best hero, the best girl, and the best villain. I like the idea of having a movie that revolves around music and where the arena is a club and the gladiators are musicians. So many movies end with a big fist fight, but this movie is about winning by being the most vulnerable and being the most creative and by moving people to the highest degree. And I think it's something that's kind of rare, and it's something that's very precious. And if you haven't seen Purple Rain, I would highly recommend it. And these are the films that people saw in the 80s. And I think that it speaks very well of Gen X that these are the movies that we plunked down our hard earned dollars that we earned at Dairy Queen to see. I mean, I think the problem that a lot of people are having with diversity these days is that a lot of it does not seem intrinsic. It doesn't seem essential. It doesn't seem to be something that emerges naturally from the piece of art that's being produced. It seems like something extrinsic that's being imposed by corporations because maybe they think they can secure a larger audience for purely cynical financial reasons. And there's a lot of films today that have a diverse cast that I just adore. And there's other ones that I see that I think are guilty of, frankly, and it's not a nice word, but tokenism and cynicism and a real lack of respect for art and artists and creativity and audiences and everything that's good in this world. I think the fact that you have people in Hollywood, of all places, trying to preach to people in certain ways is ludicrous. These are not people that are qualified to dictate the morality of anyone. And it's frankly a joke. I would love to see more movies with a black cast. When I saw Black Panther, I thought it was so cool and so fun. And I think if you want to have diversity, the best way to do it is to create stories in which the diversity is intrinsic to the story. It's part of the story. I think the example I would use, and the best example I would use, is something like Lord of the Rings, where I feel like if Amazon wanted to make a show featuring a diverse cast, they should have created a story featuring diverse characters. And you know what? I think people would have loved it. And I think I would have loved it. I would love to see a period piece, a fantasy story set in Africa or urban America or wherever, where somebody's really used their own creativity to create something that means a lot to them, and to create something where it's very specific, and it's very, I'll use the word again, intrinsic. The story is intrinsic to who they are as an artist, rather than taking something that already exists and just tacking diversity onto it. I think this is frankly very lazy, and I don't think it's very creative. Yeah, I mean, this is stuff that I wish we didn't have to talk about, because I think it would be nice if everybody could live together without really noticing race, you know. And I live in a very diverse country, and I really enjoy that. I prefer it to having grown up in a place with very little diversity. I think that I don't know how many times I've said diversity, 100, 1,000, a million. I don't know. It just seems like, but it's something that I keep hearing and hearing and hearing, and I just wish people could be cooler when it comes to this kind of stuff. And I think that when I look back at my own childhood, when I was exposed to quite a bit of diversity. And at the time, I didn't even sort of realize it. But looking back, I feel like it had a really good impact on me. I think it, it did me a lot of good. And I think it must have inspired my worldview in a lot of ways to seek out diversity in my own life. But nobody was ever, I mean, there was no message in Beverly Hills Cop. It was just like, you know what? Let's have some fun. And to me, that's the best way to get people on your side, is to give them a good time. That's why we go to the movies, is to have some fun. And I would hope that filmmakers that are coming up now and are listening to all these different conversations would think about that when they make their own next project. Job number one, let's have some fun.